Ramadan is a month full of blessings, but do you know how the first Ramadan was observed by the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his companions, radiyallahu anhu? It wasn't just about fasting, it was a time of spiritual growth, unity, and devotion. In this video, we'll take you back to the very first Ramadan in Islam, exploring how the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, set the example for us. Stay tuned to discover powerful lessons that are still relevant today. Context of the first Ramadan. The first Ramadan in Islam took place after the migration, Hijra, of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his companions, radiyallahu anhu, to Medina. Prior to this, fasting was already a known practice among the people, but it was not yet a compulsory act of worship for Muslims. The formal obligation of fasting during the month of Ramadan was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the second year of Hijra around 624 CE, when Allah sent down the verses from Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 183 to 185, making it one of the 5 pillars of Islam. This marked a significant moment in the history of Islam, as fasting was no longer optional, but a fundamental act of worship. In these verses, Allah instructed the believers to fast from dawn until sunset, abstaining from food, drink, and physical needs. This act of fasting was designed not just to discipline the body, but also to purify the soul and increase spiritual consciousness. Allah said in Surah Al-Baqarah, "O you who have believed, decreed upon you is fasting as it was decreed upon those before you, that you may become righteous." 2, 183. At this time, the Muslims in Medina were not accustomed to such a strict fast, as they had been living in a city where food and drink were readily available. The fast of Ramadan was a new, challenging, but deeply rewarding practice. The introduction of suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, and iftar, the meal to break the fast at sunset, became integral to the daily life of the Muslim community. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, also emphasized that fasting is not just abstaining from food and drink, but also from bad deeds, sinful speech, and negative behavior. It was a time for self-reflection, prayer, and seeking closeness to Allah. For the first time, the Muslims of Medina experienced Ramadan as an organized communal event led by the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who set the example for them. This was the beginning of a practice that would be followed by generations to come, creating a bond of unity, discipline, and faith among the Ummah. Fasting rules and practices for the first Ramadan. When fasting during the first Ramadan was made obligatory, it came with specific rules and practices that guided the way Muslims would observe the fast. While some elements of fasting were familiar from pre-Islamic times, the Islamic method brought structure, discipline, and deeper spiritual meaning. The duration of the fasting during Ramadan in the early days of Islam, was similar to how it is observed today, from dawn until sunset. Muslims were required to abstain from eating, drinking, and all other physical needs during the daylight hours. This meant that the fast began at the break of dawn, Fajr, and continued until the sunset, Maghrib. Suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, one of the key elements introduced by the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was the practice of having a pre-dawn meal known as suhoor. This meal was important as it helped sustain the person throughout the day of fasting. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, emphasized that even a small amount of food or water during suhoor was beneficial, and it was said that partaking of suhoor is a blessing. Sahih al-Bukhari, after breaking the fast at sunset, the fast was broken with a meal called iftar. During the first Ramadan, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, broke their fast with dates and water, which became the sunnah for how to break the fast. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, "When one of you fasts, let him break his fast with dates, and if he cannot find any, then with water, for it is pure." Sunan Abu Dawud. Breaking the fast at sunset marked not only the end of physical fasting, but also a moment of spiritual rejuvenation and gratitude. Muslims would then perform the Maghrib prayer before continuing with the meal. Abstaining from more than just food and drink, the rules of fasting weren't just about abstaining from food and drink. The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, made it clear that fasting was meant to purify the entire being, not just the body. During the first Ramadan, Muslims were encouraged to avoid sinful actions, negative speech, and immoral behavior. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, "If anyone eats or drinks forgetfully, then let him complete his fast, for what he has eaten or drunk has been given to him by Allah." Sahih al-Bukhari. This taught the companions and early Muslims that the essence of fasting was spiritual as much as it was physical. It was a time for self-reflection, controlling one's desires, and avoiding harmful actions and thoughts. The revelation of the Quran. An important feature of the first Ramadan was that it marked the beginning of the revelation of the Quran. Ramadan is the month in which the Quran was sent down as a guide for humanity, and this was a time when the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would spend long nights in prayer, reciting and reflecting on the Quran. This connection between fasting and the Quran deepened the spiritual significance of the month. The last 10 nights and increased worship. The first Ramadan also introduced the practice of increasing worship, particularly during the last 10 nights of the month. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would dedicate more time to praying during these nights, and he urged his companions to do the same, saying, "Whoever prays during the nights of Ramadan with faith and hope for reward, his previous sins will be forgiven." Sahih al-Bukhari. The role of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in Ramadan. The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, played a central role in guiding his companions during the first Ramadan, setting the standard for how to observe this sacred month with sincerity, devotion, and discipline. His example remains the model for Muslims today, and his actions during Ramadan exemplified the perfect balance of worship, humility, and charity. Setting the example in fasting, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, demonstrated the true essence of fasting through his personal dedication. He was the first to fast from dawn until sunset, refraining from food, drink, and any distractions that might interrupt his focus on worship. His commitment to fasting was not just physical but deeply spiritual. He showed the Sahaba radiyallahu anhu that fasting was a time to purify the soul, to cleanse the heart of negative traits, and to strengthen one's connection with Allah. His discipline in fasting reminded the companions that the fast was not just about abstaining from food, but about spiritual growth and self-control. Increased devotion to prayer. During the first Ramadan, the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, increased his prayers, particularly his night prayers, tahajjud. He spent long nights in worship, reciting the Quran, making dua, supplication, and reflecting on the divine revelations. Ramadan was not just a time for physical abstention, but a time to draw closer to Allah through increased acts of worship. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would lead his companions in Taraweeh prayers, which were initially prayed in congregation at the mosque, showing the importance of communal worship during this month. His devotion to prayer was a clear example for the Muslims of how to dedicate oneself to worship during Ramadan. The Prophet's emphasis on charity. The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was known for his generosity, but during Ramadan, his acts of charity were even more pronounced. He reminded the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, that fasting was not only about personal sacrifice, but also about supporting those in need. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, encouraged Muslims to increase their acts of charity during Ramadan, from feeding the hungry to supporting the poor and orphans. One of his well-known sayings was, "The best charity is that which is given during Ramadan." Tirmidhi, through his example, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, taught that Ramadan was a time to not just purify oneself, but also to look after the welfare of others. Teaching the importance of family and community, during Ramadan, the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, placed a strong emphasis on family and community unity. He encouraged his followers to break their fast together, to offer prayers together, and to be mindful of their relationships with others. Ramadan was not just a personal journey, but a time for the entire Muslim community to come together, support one another, and strengthen their bonds. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would often invite the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, to his home for iftar, the meal to break the fast, showing that the month of fasting was also about fostering a spirit of togetherness and brotherhood. The Prophet's focus on reflection and gratitude, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, often reminded the companions to use Ramadan as a time for reflection and gratitude. He would frequently engage in deep contemplation and encourage his followers to do the same. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, reminded his companions that Ramadan was a time to seek forgiveness from Allah, to purify the heart, and to renew one's commitment to the faith. He would say, "Whoever fasts during Ramadan with faith and seeking reward from Allah, his previous sins will be forgiven." Sahih al-Bukhari. His words and actions helped instill a sense of humility and spiritual reflection in his followers, showing that Ramadan was a time for inner renewal and closeness to Allah. How the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, observed their first Ramadan. The Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, were the first to observe the month of Ramadan after it became obligatory. Their experience of fasting in the first Ramadan was filled with both challenges and spiritual growth, as they closely followed the guidance of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and learned to embrace the full meaning of fasting. Their devotion and commitment during this sacred month set a high standard for generations to come. Adherence to the Prophet's example, the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, looked to the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as the perfect example in all aspects of life, including fasting. They diligently followed his practices, fasting from dawn to sunset, eating the pre-dawn meal suhoor, and breaking their fast with dates and water at sunset iftar. They knew that the fast was not just about abstaining from food and drink, but also about purifying their hearts and increasing their devotion to Allah. Their fasts were marked by acts of kindness, extra prayers, and deep reflection. The spirit of sacrifice and patience for the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu. Fasting during the first Ramadan was a time of personal sacrifice. They were accustomed to a life where food and drink were readily available, especially in Medina. Yet, despite the physical challenges, they displayed remarkable patience and determination. They understood that fasting was not just a test of endurance, but a spiritual exercise to strengthen their relationship with Allah. Many of the companions, including the elderly and those who were unwell, still managed to observe the fast with great commitment. Increased acts of worship as the first Ramadan progressed. The Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, followed the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in increasing their worship during this blessed month. They engaged in extra prayers, particularly the night prayers, Taraweeh, and they spent their time reciting and reflecting on the Quran, which was revealed during Ramadan. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, encouraged the companions to make the most of the spiritual rewards of Ramadan, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, responded with enthusiasm, seeking to grow closer to Allah through worship, supplication, and self-reflection. Charity and compassion for others. One of the most notable aspects of how the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, observed Ramadan was their focus on charity. They followed the Prophet's example in being more generous during this month, giving to the poor, feeding the hungry, and supporting those in need. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had emphasized that charity in Ramadan was particularly virtuous, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, embraced this with open hearts. They were not only fasting to purify themselves, but also to create a sense of unity and compassion within the community. Seeking forgiveness and spiritual purification. For the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, Ramadan was a time to seek forgiveness for past mistakes and purify the soul. They took advantage of the opportunity to renew their faith, seek Allah's mercy, and strive for greater self-discipline. Their hearts were full of sincerity as they fasted, prayed, and reflected. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had taught them that Ramadan was a time of spiritual renewal, and they made the most of it by repenting for their sins and striving to improve themselves in the sight of Allah. The joy of breaking the fast together. The Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, also cherished the moment of breaking their fast together at iftar. The communal nature of the fast strengthened the bond between them, as they gathered to share the blessings of the meal and offer thanks to Allah. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, encouraged the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, to break their fast quickly and to do so with gratitude. The sense of unity and brotherhood was evident, and it became a reminder of the importance of community in Islam. Lessons learned from the first Ramadan. The first Ramadan in Islam, observed by the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, offers timeless lessons that are relevant for Muslims today. Their experiences during this sacred month provide deep spiritual insights and practical guidance for how to approach Ramadan and life in general. Here are some of the key lessons learned from the first Ramadan. The importance of self-discipline and patience. One of the most profound lessons from the first Ramadan is the importance of self-discipline. Fasting requires patience and control over one's desires. The Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, showed immense endurance and discipline during the fast, even though it was a new practice. Their commitment to abstaining from food, drink, and sinful behavior taught them to strengthen their self-control. This discipline is not limited to fasting. It serves as a reminder that we can overcome distractions and desires in all aspects of life to focus on what truly matters: our relationship with Allah, spiritual growth, and reflection. The first Ramadan emphasized that fasting is not just a physical act, but a spiritual one. It's a time for reflection, purification, and spiritual renewal. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, used Ramadan as an opportunity to increase their worship, engage in prayer, and seek forgiveness for past wrongs. Ramadan is a chance to reflect on one's life, to improve spiritually, and to renew one's commitment to Allah. The lesson is clear. Ramadan is a time to grow closer to Allah, to purify the heart, and to seek personal transformation. Charity and community spirit. Another key lesson is the importance of charity and helping others, especially during Ramadan. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, encouraged the Sahaba, radiyallahu anhu, to be generous, to feed the poor, and to support those in need. The first Ramadan set the foundation for a strong community spirit, where Muslims came together not only in worship, but also in acts of kindness and support. This communal aspect of Ramadan reminds us to focus not only on our own fasting but also on the welfare of others, fostering a spirit of empathy, generosity, and social responsibility. The power of gratitude and contentment. The first Ramadan taught the Sahaba radiallahu anhu the importance of gratitude. When they broke their fast, they did so with thanks to Allah for providing sustenance and for the opportunity to fast. The practice of fasting itself, abstaining from food and drink, reminded them of the blessings they often took for granted. Gratitude for the simple things in life, such as food, water, and health, became more profound during Ramadan. The lesson is to live with greater contentment and to remember Allah's blessings, especially in moments of difficulty. Strengthening family and social bonds. Ramadan is not just about personal worship. It's also about strengthening family and community ties. The first Ramadan saw the Sahaba radiallahu anhu fasting together, breaking their fast together, and supporting one another in worship. This sense of togetherness and unity was one of the most important aspects of the first Ramadan. The lesson here is that Ramadan is a time to nurture relationships, to strengthen bonds of love and support, and to foster a sense of unity in the family and the wider community. Renewed focus on the Quran. The Quran was revealed during the month of Ramadan, and the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Sahaba, radiallahu anhu, made it a point to engage deeply with the Quran during this month. The first Ramadan taught the companions the value of reflecting on the Quran's guidance, reciting it regularly, and seeking to understand its meanings. For Muslims today, this lesson underscores the importance of making time for the Quran during Ramadan, not just in terms of recitation, but also in reflection and application of its teachings in our daily lives. Fasting as a means of forgiveness. Lastly, the first Ramadan showed the Sahaba radiallahu anhu that fasting is not only an act of devotion but also a means of forgiveness. The Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, taught that those who fast with sincerity and seek Allah's reward will have their sins forgiven. This reinforces the idea that Ramadan is a time for spiritual renewal and for seeking Allah's mercy. The lesson is that fasting during Ramadan is not just about refraining from food, but it's an opportunity for purification and a chance to start anew with a clean heart. These lessons from the first Ramadan are valuable teachings that Muslims continue to carry with them throughout the month and beyond. They remind us of the deeper meanings of fasting, discipline, charity, gratitude, spiritual growth, and unity, and encourage us to implement these lessons in our daily lives, making every Ramadan a time for reflection, improvement, and connection with Allah.